It's March 25th, 2009. We're in Gatineau, Quebec for the roundtable What Role for Canada in the Americas, which is organized by the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. I'm speaking to David Abdulah, who is a distinguished visitor to Canada. I'm going to ask David to introduce himself, please.
Thank you very much, Ish. Yes, I'm the General Secretary of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union in Trinidad and Tobago. It is one of the premier unions in the country. We are 72 years old, and I'm also the president of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs, which we pronounce as FITON, which is the federation to which the Oilfield Workers Trade Union is affiliated in Trinidad and Tobago. And we are here to share with Canadian counterparts on this whole issue of the Americas at this moment and some of the things that Canada perhaps should be looking at, both in terms of government and social movements here in Canada at this particular moment. As everybody knows, we're in a moment of great crises, because it's not just a single crisis, there's several. It's the financial one that has perhaps gotten most attention, but there are other issues, the economic crisis in relation to productive sectors, the auto sector and other sectors that have been affected. We have the environmental crisis. There are many countries, there's a crisis of governance and citizenship. There's the food crisis. There's a crisis of energy sustainability and so on. So there are many different dimensions of problems that face us in the Americas. And it's an interesting moment, and I'm here particularly because, as you know, in another couple of weeks, the heads of 34 countries from this hemisphere, the Americas, will be in my country, Trinidad and Tobago, for the 5th Summit of the Americas. And parallel to that is going to be the 4th People's Summit, and we are organizing that as a space for social movements to discuss these issues and to articulate alternative views, policies, paradigms to the prevailing neoliberal order, which, as everybody can see, has failed, has collapsed, as evidenced by the financial and other crises. So we're here to share what is going to be happening in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as to say the crucial issues with respect to Caribbean-Canada relations. There is right now being negotiated a CARICOM, which is the Caribbean Community of Nations, and Canada Free Trade Agreement, which is to replace the existing Caribbean Canada agreement, which was set up in the 1980s as a one-way preferential trade agreement. And the new CARICOM, Canada Free Trade Agreement, is really an extension of the WTO. It's going to be similar to NAFTA in many respects, and we're here to say that we do not wish to see that kind of trade agreement being established, because it will have many negative impacts on workers, on farmers, on women, on young people in the Caribbean.
Now, the free trade area of the Americas was halted, as I understand it. Is this another attempt by those favoring the neoliberalism, as you call it? Is this another attempt to do the same thing as FTAA attempted to do?
Yes, in fact, I think the United States and Canada adopted a strategy position that with the collapse of the free trade area of the Americas, the way to achieve the same objective would be by having a series of bilateral trade agreements. So the United States and Canada have negotiated or are negotiating bilateral agreements with many countries in South America and Central America, and now turning their attention to the Caribbean. When all of those agreements bilaterally are signed between the U.S. on the one hand and countries of the South, between Canada on the one hand and countries of the South, and given NAFTA, in which Canada and the United States are participants, we in fact will end up with a free trade area of the Americas, but by a different route. So we have to recognize that strategic shift to achieve the same objective of the FTA, and as the FTA was resisted, so too we ought to be resisting these bilateral agreements.
How has the environment changed since the election of Barack Obama as U.S. president? Is Canada's attempt at negotiating free trade agreements with countries like Colombia, is it more or less isolated at this point, or is it or are there a number of countries that are still pursuing this route?
Well, it'd be interesting to see precisely what the Obama administration's position is going to be on free trade agreements. There have been some signals that he's not happy with what was happening before, but I don't think it's a clear, definitive policy position coming out of the United States administration opposing the free trade agreements. I think what they're seeking to do is to put in some reforms, albeit maybe minor reforms. And so it is also a moment not only to shift Canada's position, but also to try decisively to shift the U.S. position.
What do you think Canadians need to know?
They need to know what these agreements are in substance, and the implications of them, not only for people here in Canada, but for implications for people in the countries that are party to those agreements, in terms of the impact on sovereignty, in the same way that NAFTA, for example, has impacted on Canadian policy space. Because there are some economic and social policies that you cannot pursue because they've been in violation of NAFTA, in the same way that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, also impacts on national sovereignty in terms of decision-making space. So too these bilateral agreements. Now, when they're between a large country, Canada, United States on the one hand, and small countries, Trinidad and Tobago is a small country. We have a population of 1.2 million. CARICOM has a very small population. We have even smaller countries within CARICOM, 100,000 people, very vulnerable to all kinds of external shocks. One major hurricane passed through Grenada 4 years ago and devastated the entire economy in an hour. Those are the external shocks from the environment, but there are also external shocks in terms of the global crisis. So that when tourism, for example, it declines because of the crash of Wall Street and its cascading impacts, then the tourism economies of the Caribbean are severely impacted upon, and workers lose their jobs, and we don't earn foreign exchange. So that we have to understand that these trade agreements between asymmetrical countries in relationship to power adversely impact more on us than on larger countries. And we need to have an appreciation of this throughout Canadian society and within our own countries as well.
Thank you very much, David Abdulah, and good luck with your work.
Thank you.